There is a name that for more than a century has meant something specific in the American imagination, not merely wealth, not merely success, something more precise than either of those things. The idea that a man born to nothing could build everything and then give it all away, and die having proved something fundamental about what was possible in this country. Andrew Carnegie understood that idea better than almost anyone who has ever lived because he had constructed it deliberately, with the same systematic intelligence he brought to the manufacture of steel, the same attention to cost and output and competitive advantage that had made him the richest man in the world. He arrived in America at 12 years old in steerage, speaking with a Scottish accent, carrying no credentials, no capital, and no connections beyond a handful of relatives in western Pennsylvania who had written to say there was work available in the mills. By 65, he was the richest man in the world. By the time he died at 83, he had given away $350 million, built nearly 3,000 libraries across 47 states and a dozen countries, founded institutions that are still operating today and still serving millions of people, and attached his name so permanently to specific ideas about wealth and moral obligation that it is genuinely impossible to discuss American philanthropy without encountering it. He also, in the summer of 1892, authorized the use of 300 armed private detectives against his own workers at a steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, watched 10 people die in the gun battle that followed, and spent the remainder of his life constructing explanations for what he had done that satisfied almost no one, including, by most accounts, himself. And then, in the middle of all of it, a woman he had never met walked into a Cleveland courtroom and nearly unmade the most carefully constructed public identity in American industrial history. Using nothing but a forged signature, a brown envelope, and an understanding of shame more sophisticated than anything Carnegie's lawyers had thought to prepare for. The secret family she claimed he was paying to stay silent was entirely invented. What it revealed about the man whose name she had borrowed turned out to be genuine. Before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. This channel is built for people who believe the real story is always more complicated than the version that gets remembered. And if that sounds like you, please subscribe so you never miss one. Now, 1835, Dunfermline, Scotland. Dunfermline in 1835 was a town that remembered being something considerable. Scotland's medieval capital for centuries, a place whose identity and economy had been built on the skill of men who worked at handlooms in their own cottages and passed the craft from father to son like an inheritance, like land, like something that could not simply be taken away by the arrival of a machine. The linen produced in Dunfermline had been considered the finest damask in Great Britain for generations. The weavers who made it had a specific and earned pride, the pride of craftsmen whose knowledge lived in their hands and in their bodies, whose skill could not be easily copied or cheaply replaced. They were not rich men, but they were skilled men, and in the world that existed before the Industrial Revolution reshaped everything, skill had a stability that mere labor did not. By the time Andrew Carnegie was born there on November 25th of that year, the town had already begun to understand what was coming. The power loom was not a rumor. It was a visible fact. In cities not far away, already operating in factories that could produce in a day what a handloom weaver produced in a week, and at a cost that no individual craftsman could compete with. The weavers of Dunfermline watched its approach with the particular and helpless dread of people who understand exactly what they are about to lose and have no mechanism for stopping it. His father, William Carnegie, owned several looms and ran a modest weaving operation that had been, within living memory, a reasonable and even comfortable way to sustain a family. William was also a Chartist, a committed member of a working-class political movement whose central argument was that ordinary people deserved the right to vote, to stand for Parliament, and to participate meaningfully in the decisions that governed their lives. He wrote letters to radical magazines. He was president of one of the local weavers' societies. Carnegie's uncle Tom Morrison organized a national general strike in 1842, was arrested for his role in it, and went to prison for a period that the family discussed as a mark of honor rather than of shame. Carnegie's uncle George Lauder ran a grocery in Dunfermline and spent the boy's earliest years filling his head with Scottish history, with the battles of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, with the poetry of Robert Burns committed to memory, with the specific and sustaining pride of a people who had been conquered more than once and had declined to stay conquered. This household produced something in Carnegie that he carried without interruption for the rest of his life. He grew up understanding, at a level deeper than conscious argument, that inherited privilege was morally indefensible, that the gap between those who owned the machinery of society and those who operated it was a problem with a moral dimension that economic reasoning alone could not resolve, and that working people deserved treatment better than the industrial system was inclined to provide. He would use this language in public throughout his entire career. He would deliver speeches about the rights of workers to organize. He would write essays about the obligations of wealth. He would present himself, consistently and with considerable skill, as a man who had come from the working class and retained its sympathies. He would also spend his career systematically dismantling every practical expression of those sympathies when they interfered with his production costs. The distance between what Carnegie said he believed and what Carnegie actually did is the central story of his life, and it begins here, in this household in Dunfermline, where the values he would spend his career contradicting were first installed. The power loom arrived in Dunfermline in the mid-1840s and destroyed the handloom trade, not gradually but rapidly. William Carnegie's business did not decline. It became obsolete within a few years, replaced by factory production that cost a fraction of what hand weaving required and produced fabric that the market was perfectly willing to accept. The family's relative comfort disappeared. Carnegie's mother, Margaret, opened a small grocery in the house and took in shoe-mending work from neighbors to supplement whatever William could earn. His father tried selling linens door to door, walking through Dunfermline with fabric that no one needed to buy from an individual craftsman when the factory-made version was cheaper and available everywhere. Carnegie wrote later that it was during these years that he first learned what poverty meant, that watching his father beg for work was burnt into his heart, then and there, and that he resolved at that moment that he would cure that condition when he became a man. Whether a child of 8 or 9 actually formed such precise and durable resolutions is a separate question from whether Carnegie believed this story about himself. He did believe it. He repeated it throughout his life. And the belief shaped everything that followed, including the things he built and the things he broke. The family borrowed money from relatives and emigrated in 1848. Carnegie was 12 years old, possibly 13, depending on which account you consult. They crossed the Atlantic in steerage passage, booked the cheapest available space, and traveled for weeks in conditions that Carnegie later described with unusual candor. Narrow shelves in hot, unventilated cabins, slow progress at 35 miles per day on the Erie Canal after the initial ocean crossing. The disorientation of arriving in a city, New York, that was unlike anything Dunfermline had prepared them for. They took a steamer up the Hudson to Albany, transferred to the canal boats, and eventually reached Buffalo, from which a final series of boat passages brought them to Pittsburgh after 3 full weeks of travel. The Carnegies settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a working neighborhood across the river from Pittsburgh proper, in a 2-room flat above a weaving shop operated by relatives who had made the same journey years before. Pittsburgh in 1848 was already a city defined by industry and by the environmental cost of industry. Its buildings were blackened with soot from the iron and glass operations already crowding the riverbanks. Carnegie wrote that any accurate description of Pittsburgh at that period would be dismissed as exaggeration, that the smoke penetrated everything and the soot gathered in the hair within an hour of washing it. His father tried to set up the handloom one more time. He sold his linens door to door. The business failed again in the same way it had failed in Dunfermline, because the industrial economy did not need him. Carnegie started work immediately as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, changing spools of thread 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for $1.20 a week. He was working a 70-hour week before his 14th birthday. In conditions that left impressions he described in detail half a century later, the noise that made conversation impossible, the heat from the boilers, the smell of machine oil, the absolute absence of anything that might be called fresh air. His formal education, which had amounted to roughly 4 years in a 1-room Dunfermline schoolhouse, was finished. There were no more classrooms. There was only the mill, and then, if he was fortunate and strategic, something better than the mill. What gave him the better thing was Colonel James Anderson, a local businessman in Allegheny who had accumulated a private library of approximately 1,500 volumes and who made the decision, remarkable in its generosity and its specificity, to open that library to working boys each Saturday evening, free of any charge. Carnegie used it every single week without exception. He read everything within reach: history, biography, political economy, literature, science, philosophy. He read without a curriculum and without a teacher, guided only by his own curiosity and by the accumulating understanding that the knowledge in those books was the mechanism by which a boy from a Dunfermline weaver's cottage could become something other than what his origins suggested. He later said that Colonel Anderson's library was the foundation of everything he became, and he meant this as a precise factual statement, not as a rhetorical flourish. When he eventually committed hundreds of millions of dollars to building public libraries across America and the English-speaking world, the specific memory that drove the decision was those Saturday evenings in Allegheny. A 13-year-old boy in a city that had not yet decided what to do with him, reading himself into a different possible future. His father died in 1855. Carnegie was 20 years old, the family's primary breadwinner, and already moving beyond the cotton mill. He had found work as a telegraph messenger, then taught himself Morse code by listening to the machine rather than studying it from a text, which was faster and more reliable and characteristic of how his mind worked throughout his life. He became one of the fastest telegraph operators in Pittsburgh, and what he discovered in that telegraph office, the first room he had ever been in where speed of thought was valued more than strength of body, was that this was the kind of room he intended to spend his life in. The man who would accelerate everything in Carnegie's career was already at the center of Pittsburgh's railroad operations when their paths converged, and he possessed a specific talent that Carnegie identified and studied with the close attention he brought to everything that might be useful. Thomas A. Scott knew how to find people who would be valuable to him and how to attach them to his own trajectory. He was the superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest corporation in America. A methodical and strategically brilliant man who had risen through the railroad hierarchy by understanding that loyalty and information were the two most valuable currencies in the industrial economy, and that a man who controlled access to both could shape events in ways that pure financial capital could not. Scott hired Carnegie as his personal telegrapher and secretary in 1853, when Carnegie was 18 years old at $4 per week. It was the most consequential hiring decision in Carnegie's life, and it was Scott's decision, not Carnegie's. What followed was not merely a job, it was an education in how wealth actually accumulated in Gilded Age America, conducted by a master practitioner who had no particular incentive to conceal his methods from a protege he had chosen to trust. What Scott taught Carnegie extended far beyond railroad management and organizational structure. He showed him how positional access could generate personal investment returns, how a man inside a major institution could use his knowledge of that institution's needs and purchasing decisions to create opportunities that the institution itself would then fulfill. When a share in the Woodruff Sleeping Car company became available through Scott's network, Scott mentioned it to Carnegie and suggested he find a way to buy it. Carnegie's mother mortgaged the family's house in Allegheny for $500 to secure the investment. The first dividend check arrived some months later, and Carnegie wrote about that moment as a genuine turning point in his understanding of what money was capable of. It was the first income he had ever received that had not required his own physical labor to produce. Capital had worked on his behalf while he slept. The insight that followed from this experience, that money properly deployed could generate more money without the investor's direct effort, reoriented his understanding of what building a fortune actually required. Carnegie rose through the Pennsylvania Railroad with a speed that reflected both genuine talent and the considerable advantage of his relationship with Scott. By 1859, at 24 years old, he was superintendent of the Pittsburgh division of the entire railroad, earning $1,500 a year, a solidly middle-class income that placed him in a different economic world from the cotton mill, where he had started 11 years earlier. He had become in those 6 years under Scott. not merely an effective railroad manager, but a strategic partner in a series of investment arrangements that used insider position to generate returns. Scott, Carnegie, and J. Edgar Thomson, the Pennsylvania Railroad's president, organized companies together, companies that were then awarded contracts to supply the Pennsylvania Railroad with raw materials and to build its iron bridges across the expanding rail network. Scott and Thomson were silent partners in enterprises that received business from the institution they ran. This practice was common in the Gilded Age, accepted within the business culture of the period, and entirely inconsistent with the portrait of self-made success through merit alone that Carnegie would later cultivate. He learned the model without hesitation, used it consistently through his entire rise to wealth, and gave it very little space in his later accounts of how he had built his fortune from nothing. The Civil War arrived in 1861, and Scott became Assistant Secretary of War in charge of military transportation for the Union. Carnegie followed him to Washington as Superintendent of Military Railways and Telegraph Lines for the federal government. He was present near the Battle of Bull Run in the earliest weeks of the conflict and helped coordinate the repair of rail lines that Confederate forces had damaged, which gave him a direct experience of the war's physical reality that most men of his economic class arranged to avoid. He was eventually drafted and paid $850 for a substitute to serve in his place, a legal exemption available under the draft law of the period and used commonly by men who could afford it. This practice was not illegal. It was also not consistent with the democratic principles his father had organized his political life around, or with the public stance Carnegie would maintain throughout his life as a man whose sympathies lay with ordinary working people rather than with the privileged class that could purchase its way out of national service. Carnegie acknowledged this briefly in his autobiography and moved on from it quickly. He did not return to it. His wartime position gave him something more durable than the experience itself, detailed and specific knowledge of what post-war America would need to rebuild and expand. From inside the machinery of the Union war effort, he could see with unusual clarity which materials the reconstruction and infrastructure boom would consume in quantities that had not yet been imagined. He began investing in iron mills as the war concluded. By the time he was 30 years old, Carnegie had an annual income of approximately $50,000, the majority of it coming from investments rather than from any salary. He resigned from the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1865 to manage his holdings and pursue new opportunities full-time. He was not yet in steel, but he had already understood with more precision than almost anyone else in America what steel was going to mean for the coming generation. He had spent 12 years learning the railroad business from the inside, which gave him a clarity about what the next 20 years of American construction would need that no outside observer could have matched. And what it would need, in quantities not yet conceivable, was steel. Steel in the 1860s was still an expensive and specialized product, its uses limited by its cost to applications where iron simply would not serve. Henry Bessemer, the English engineer, had developed a process for producing steel in large quantities at a fraction of the previous price, using a converter that forced air through molten pig iron to burn off the impurities that made iron brittle. Carnegie saw Bessemer's plants operating in Britain during a visit in 1872 and understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a technical improvement, a structural transformation of the entire construction economy of the industrialized world. Steel would replace iron in railroad rails, in the bridges that carried those rails across rivers and valleys, in the columns that would support the new tall buildings beginning to appear in American cities. The demand that was coming would be unlike anything the industry had yet experienced, and the man who controlled production at the scale that demand required would control American industrial development for a generation. He committed to steel between 1872 and 1873, founding near Pittsburgh the operation he named the J. Edgar Thomson Steel Works, a deliberate and calculated tribute to the railroad president who had been his patron and who would now be his best customer. The Pennsylvania Railroad needed steel rails in enormous quantities. Carnegie needed the Pennsylvania Railroad's purchasing contracts. The name on the furnace was a standing acknowledgment of that alignment, visible to anyone who visited the works and understood what it meant. His competitive strategy combined three elements that no rival managed to assemble simultaneously, and the combination was what separated Carnegie Steel from every other operation in the industry. First, he integrated vertically, buying not just the steel mills, but the ore fields in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, where iron ore sat so close to the surface that it could be scooped with steam shovels rather than blasted from underground tunnels at a fraction of conventional mining costs. He bought the ships to carry that ore across Lake Superior and down through the Great Lakes, the railroad to move it from the lake shores to Pittsburgh, and the coke fields that fueled his furnaces. He controlled every input and every output, which meant that when steel prices fell, as they periodically did, he could cut costs at every point in the supply chain, while competitors, who bought their raw materials at market prices, were squeezed from both sides. Second, he adopted every significant technological advance before his competitors were ready to commit to it. He installed Bessemer converters while other producers were still evaluating the economics. He added open hearth furnaces in the 1890s, when most of his rivals were still debating whether to invest. Each new technology reduced his cost per ton and widened the margin between his operation and those of every competitor. Carnegie's instructions to his plant managers were consistent and unambiguous. Find out what the newest process is, determine what it costs to install it, and if it reduces production cost, install it immediately. He did not wait for a technology to become standard. He made it standard. Third, and perhaps most important to the daily operation of his competitive advantage, he introduced into his mills a system of detailed cost accounting that was unprecedented in American manufacturing at the time. Every step in the production process had a documented cost, tracked against the previous week and the previous month and the same period in the previous year. Every manager was measured against those numbers with a precision that left no room for approximation. Carnegie knew the exact cost of every ton of pig iron his operation produced before his competitors had a reliable estimate of their own costs. This operational intelligence, combined with vertical integration and early adoption of new technology, produced an organization that could undercut any competitor in the industry and still operate profitably at prices that drove those competitors toward ruin. By the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel was the largest manufacturer of pig iron steel rails and coke in the world, with the capacity to produce approximately 2,000 tons of pig iron per day. By 1889, American steel output had exceeded that of Great Britain for the first time in the history of either country, and Carnegie owned a dominant share of American production. That same year, he published in the North American Review an essay that would define his public identity as thoroughly as the steel mills had defined his fortune. The piece argued that a man who accumulates great wealth has a moral obligation to distribute it, that surplus fortune, beyond what a comfortable family life requires, is a public trust rather than a private inheritance, and that a man who holds his money until death dies in a specific and identifiable form of disgrace. He was 53 years old when he wrote it. He believed every word, and 3 years later he would authorize an action that made those words extremely difficult to defend publicly, and by the evidence of his private correspondence, nearly impossible to defend even to himself. But before the crisis that would define his public reputation for the rest of his life and beyond it, there is a different story that deserves its proper telling, and it belongs to the woman who held Carnegie in place for the first 51 years of his existence. Margaret Morrison Carnegie was formidable in the specific way that practical, intelligent, and possessive women in the 19th century learned to exercise their considerable force. Through complete and meticulous management of the domestic world they controlled, and through the emotional authority that came from being demonstrably and irreplaceably indispensable to someone who needed them. She had pushed the family out of Scotland when William's weaving business made staying impossible. She had held the household together through the poverty of the early Pittsburgh years, running the grocery, mending shoes, keeping Carnegie's father from despair, and Carnegie himself fed and housed while he found his footing. She had been, by Carnegie's own consistent account across decades of correspondence and memoir, the central figure of his life and the engine of the family's survival. He said in his autobiography that she was a heroine whose story he doubted he could ever fully tell. He was right that he never fully told it, though not for the reasons he implied. He had made a vow, stated explicitly on more than one occasion, that he would not marry while his mother lived. Whether this commitment was entirely voluntary on his part, whether it represented a genuine moral conviction, or a convenient arrangement that allowed him to remain the center of a household organized entirely around his needs, is something the historical record does not definitively resolve. What the record does show is that Margaret was not passive in her opposition to Carnegie's romantic prospects. When a serious candidate appeared, she found ways to complicate the path with a consistency that suggested deliberate effort rather than coincidence. Louise Whitfield was born on March 7, 1857, in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan, the daughter of John Whitfield, a prosperous New York textile merchant whose family had been in America since the 1600s. She was 23 years old when she met the 45-year-old Carnegie through her father in 1880, and the friendship that developed over the following months was conducted largely on horseback through Central Park, which both of them used regularly and which provided a neutral ground for a relationship that both families were watching with varying degrees of enthusiasm. She told Carnegie, with a directness he found refreshing, that she had no interest in marrying a man who had already achieved wealth and prominence. She wanted to help someone become successful, to be part of the construction of something rather than an accessory to something already built. Carnegie told her he intended to give his entire fortune away before he died. Both statements were essentially true, and both had a quality of careful presentation that suited the temperament of two highly intelligent people, assessing each other over a period of months. They became secretly engaged in September of 1883. Setting a wedding date turned out to be something Carnegie found impossible. His mother was not told of the engagement, and she worked, with the effectiveness of someone who knew her son's weaknesses precisely, to complicate the relationship at every opportunity. When Carnegie arranged for Louise to join the family on their triumphal return visit to Dunfermline in 1881, an event he had been planning for years as a demonstration to the town of what he had become, his mother paid a visit to the Whitfield household. She was asked by Louise's mother whether such a trip abroad was appropriate for a young unmarried woman traveling without a chaperone from her own family. Margaret Carnegie answered that if Louise were her daughter, she would not go. Louise stayed in New York. The engagement was eventually called off by mutual agreement sometime in the months that followed, though the relationship itself continued. The autumn of 1886 arrived with a series of catastrophes compressed into a span of weeks that Carnegie later described as the most devastating period of his life. He contracted typhoid fever at his retreat in Cresson, Pennsylvania, in late summer. His brother Tom developed pneumonia within a week of Carnegie's illness being diagnosed and died on October 19th at the age of 43, leaving behind a wife and 9 children. Margaret Carnegie, already weakened by her own declining health, could not sustain the compounded shock of both her sons' simultaneous illnesses and died on November 11th at the age of 77. She was not told of Tom's death before she died. Carnegie was not told of his mother's death for 3 weeks after it occurred, until his doctors judged him recovered enough from the typhoid to survive the news. The family had her coffin lowered out of a bedroom window at the back of the house so that Carnegie would not encounter it being carried through the hallway, where he was convalescing. Carnegie wrote to Louise immediately upon learning of his mother's death. His first communication after receiving the news was to her. He wrote that he was wholly hers now, that she was everything he had remaining, that he lived in her going forward. They were married 5 months later on April 22, 1887, at the Whitfield family home on West 48th Street in New York, a private ceremony attended by family and a small number of close friends. Louise wore a gray wool traveling suit, practical and understated, and entirely characteristic of her approach to everything that was not absolutely required to be formal. Carnegie was 51 years old. Louise was 30. She signed a prenuptial agreement renouncing all claims to his fortune. In return, he transferred to her stocks and bonds, generating an independent annual income of $20,000. This arrangement was not a mechanism for protecting his assets from her claims. It was a shared and deliberate commitment to the philosophy he had already articulated publicly. The fortune was not his to keep, and he wanted her to understand and agree to that before the marriage began. On the ocean crossing to their honeymoon in England and Scotland, the newlyweds fell into conversation with Walter Damrosch, the conductor of the Symphony Society of New York, who described his vision for a great music hall in the city, a proper concert venue that all New Yorkers could attend regardless of their means. Louise mentioned to Carnegie that this was something worth doing. Carnegie agreed before the ship had finished crossing. Carnegie Hall opened in 1891, and he paid its operating deficits alone every year from that opening until his death in 1919, because he never stopped thinking of it as Louise's idea brought into existence through his resources. They were married for 32 years, and by every account that has survived them, they were genuinely and durably happy together. What came next would test everything that happiness was built on. Homestead, Pennsylvania sat on the Monongahela River 7 miles east of Pittsburgh, and by 1892 it was the most closely watched industrial site in America, not because of its production numbers, but because of what happened there in the summer of that year, in a 14-hour gun battle on the riverbank that killed 10 people and made the distance between Andrew Carnegie's publicly stated beliefs and his privately authorized actions impossible for anyone to overlook. Homestead was different from Carnegie's other operations in a way that mattered enormously to what followed. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had genuine organizational strength there, built over years of successful collective action. Skilled workers had negotiated a contract in 1889 that tied their wages to steel prices, so that when Carnegie Steel prospered, they prospered in proportion. They had a meaningful voice in production rules. They understood their daily presence in the furnaces and on the production floor as having earned something beyond their hourly rate, a stake in the operation that gave them a legitimate interest in its decisions. They said this openly and defended it with the conviction of people who had thought about it carefully. Carnegie's partner Henry Clay Frick believed they were entirely wrong, and he held this belief with a consistency and force that Carnegie found useful to have at a careful distance. Frick was Carnegie's choice to manage the confrontation at Homestead, and he was temperamentally well-suited to a role that required doing things that Carnegie preferred not to be seen doing. He had built his first fortune in the Pennsylvania coke fields, where unions were prohibited and workers were controlled by methods that Carnegie admired from a safe political distance. As the union's contract approached its June 30th, 1892 expiration, Carnegie and Frick agreed in private correspondence on what they actually wanted from the negotiation. Not a modified contract, but the permanent elimination of the union's presence at Homestead, a reorganization of the entire operation on terms that management could set without collective bargaining. Carnegie arranged for the mill to build maximum inventory before he departed for Scotland on his annual summer trip, ensuring the company could sustain a long work stoppage without losing competitive position. He gave Frick written authorization that amounted to an open mandate to proceed with whatever measures were required. Then he went to his remote retreat at Loch Rannoch in the Scottish Highlands, where he was accessible to Frick through private cables and completely inaccessible to the press, to members of Congress, and to the workers whose livelihoods he was in the process of destroying. Frick opened the negotiation with a demand for a 22% wage reduction, affecting nearly half the union's membership, a figure calculated with precision to be unacceptable. He ordered the construction of a 12-foot barbed wire fence topped with rifle slits and water cannons around the entire plant perimeter. The workers named it Fort Frick. On July 2nd, Frick fired all 3,800 employees, union and non-union alike. In the darkness before dawn on July 6th, 300 Pinkerton agents hired by Frick traveled up the Monongahela River in 2 covered barges, intending to arrive and occupy the plant before the workers could organize a defense. Workers stationed along the riverbank spotted the barges as they approached and sent alerts through the sleeping town. Thousands of workers and their families rushed to the waterfront with weapons before the Pinkertons could disembark. The battle that followed lasted 14 hours. When it ended, 10 people were dead, 7 workers, and 3 Pinkertons. The Pinkerton agents surrendered and were forced to walk through a crowd of striking workers as they withdrew from the property, and they were beaten as they passed. Pennsylvania's governor responded to the carnage by sending 8,500 state militia troops to occupy the town. The plant reopened on July 15th with replacement workers recruited from other states. By November, the Amalgamated Association had voted to end the strike and abandon its presence at Homestead. It would not return. Carnegie's public response from Scotland was carefully calibrated to protect his reputation while asserting nothing true about his actual role. He told the New York Times that he wished to bury the past, of which he had known nothing while it was occurring. His private cables to Frick from Scotland had already told a different story. He approved of anything Frick decided, This was Frick's chance to reorganize the entire operation. He had full authority to proceed. The press was not deceived. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published an editorial stating that 10,000 Carnegie public libraries would not compensate the country for the direct and indirect evils resulting from the Homestead lockout, and said of Carnegie himself that he was a coward. A congressman from Ohio called him the arch-sneak of the age. A Scottish newspaper noted with an irony it made no effort to disguise the strike-breaking methods prevailing in the land of triumphant democracy, which happened to be the title of Carnegie's most recent book celebrating American progress. An anarchist named Alexander Berkman, who had no connection to the Union or to the striking workers, shot Frick in his Pittsburgh office on July 23rd in an assassination attempt. Frick refused anesthesia during the surgery that followed, guided the physician's removal of the bullets from his neck and back, and returned to his desk within hours. This display of public fortitude in the face of violence changed the political atmosphere in ways that benefited Carnegie. Popular sympathy shifted away from the strikers and toward the industrialist who had nearly lost his operational manager to a violent attack. Carnegie was not responsible for this shift, but he benefited from it more than he had earned. Carnegie Steel's profits in the 9 years following Homestead reached $106 million, which was the financial argument for the strategy expressed with a numerical precision that required no interpretation. He had won at Homestead in every way that could be measured in dollars, and the cost of winning in the currency of the public identity he had spent decades building was not something that any amount of subsequent generosity could fully repay. He established a pension fund for former Homestead workers. He funded a library in the town that many of those workers refused to use. He did not return to the subject in his autobiography with the directness the record required. He carried it forward. The empire that Homestead had secured for him was, by the 1890s, operating at a scale that made the numbers difficult to hold in the mind. Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Great Britain combined. The profits in 1900 alone reached $40 million for the company, of which Carnegie's personal share was $25 million in a single calendar year. He was 5 feet 3 inches tall, compact, and physically energetic in a way that made his presence in any room immediately apparent. Everyone who spent time with him described the same quality. He was the most alive person in any gathering he attended. He led groups in song at dinner parties, told stories that kept tables of distinguished guests in place for hours, debated political and philosophical questions with a genuine engagement that made his interlocutors feel he was genuinely interested in being persuaded rather than merely in persuading. He was a regular contributor to major American and British magazines and journals, and considered himself with considerable justification a serious public intellectual as well as an industrialist. He associated with presidents and prime ministers, corresponded with philosophers and economists, invited Booker T. Washington to dinner, funded the Tuskegee Institute, helped Washington establish the National Negro Business League, donated 7,500 pipe organs to congregations across America and around the world because he loved the music of his Scottish childhood and wanted other people to have access to it, and described himself throughout all of this as a positivist who did not attend church and did not consider himself bound by religious obligation to any of it. He and Louise built their lives across 3 properties that together trace the geography of his public and private identity. The Manhattan Mansion at 2 East 91st Street on Fifth Avenue was completed in 1902, a Georgian revival structure that occupied a full city block on the corner of Fifth Avenue and was large enough to feel permanent, institutional, more like a civic building than a private home. Skibo Castle in the Scottish Highlands near Dornoch was purchased in 1898 for £85,000, a ruined property of 28,000 acres that Carnegie rebuilt and expanded into a working estate where the family spent each summer, hosting guests who ranged from Rudyard Kipling to King Edward VII. Shadowbrook, their summer estate in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts at Lenox, was where Carnegie would eventually spend his final months. Their daughter Margaret was born on March 30th, 1897. Carnegie was 61 years old when she arrived, and he was by accounts a devoted and somewhat uncertain father, a man who had spent 4 decades making enormous decisions at industrial speed and who found the smaller negotiations of early parenthood genuinely challenging. Louise managed the household and Margaret's upbringing with the same practical clarity she brought to everything else, including the philanthropic program she was steadily shaping through her consistent influence on Carnegie's thinking about how the giving should be structured. When J.P. Morgan approached Carnegie in early 1901 about purchasing the entire steel operation, Carnegie wrote $480 million on a piece of paper and passed it across the table. Morgan agreed to the figure without negotiation. Carnegie received payment primarily in first mortgage gold bonds and required a vault to be constructed specifically to hold them. He was the richest man in the world, and he had made a promise in public about what that condition required of him. He had promised in print that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. He had $350 million and approximately 2 decades to demonstrate that this was a commitment rather than a rhetorical flourish. The philanthropy that followed the sale was guided by a specific and coherent philosophy rather than a general impulse toward generosity, and the distinction mattered to Carnegie as much as the scale of the giving. He had argued in The Gospel of Wealth that surplus wealth must not simply relieve immediate distress, because relieving distress addressed symptoms while leaving the conditions that produced it unchanged. The money must go instead to institutions that helped people help themselves. Libraries where a working boy could read himself toward a different kind of future. Schools where skill and knowledge were available regardless of birth. Concert halls where music and culture were not restricted to those who could afford private access. The difference between charity and institutional investment was fundamental to his understanding of what he was doing, and Louise reinforced this consistently throughout the philanthropic years, pushing for endowments over individual gifts and for structures that would continue operating long after both of them were gone. Libraries were first because the specific memory driving them was the most personal and concrete he possessed. Colonel Anderson's library in Allegheny, with its 1,500 volumes available each Saturday evening to working boys with no money and enormous curiosity, had been the foundation of Carnegie's education, and therefore of everything that education made possible. He knew this with the certainty of a man who had compared the proposition against his own experience and found it reliable. His method required local authorities to provide the land and ongoing operating budget. He provided the building. The arrangement made every library a community commitment rather than a pure gift, and Carnegie believed that distinction was essential to making the investment durable. By the time the program concluded, approximately 3,000 libraries had been built across 47 American states, and in Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and a dozen other countries. In 1900, he founded the Carnegie Technical Schools in Pittsburgh, which eventually became Carnegie Mellon University. In 1902, he established the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington to support scientific research across multiple disciplines. In 1903, he contributed $1.5 million toward the construction of the Peace Palace at The Hague, which was intended to house an international court of arbitration, and which he hoped would become the institutional expression of his conviction that wars between civilized nations could be prevented by law rather than settled by violence. In 1904, he created the Carnegie Hero Fund with $5 million to recognize civilians who risked their lives to save others. Inspired by a coal mine disaster in Harwick, Pennsylvania, where 2 men died attempting to rescue trapped workers. In 1905, he endowed the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching with $10 million to create pension security for American college professors, a program that evolved eventually into the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, which today manages more than $860 billion in combined assets on behalf of more than 5 million active and retired employees. In 1910, he gave $10 million to establish the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, with written instructions to its trustees that the fund's income should be directed toward hastening the abolition of war, which he described in his letter to the trustees as the foulest blot upon our civilization. When that goal was achieved, they were to move on to the next most serious evil remaining. He framed this as a sequence of practical and achievable tasks, not as an aspiration or a wish. In 1911, he established the Carnegie Corporation of New York with $125 million, having recognized that he could not distribute the entire fortune himself before he ran out of time, and that an institution was required to continue the work after his death. Louise's influence on the shape and direction of all of this was more consequential than most historical accounts of Carnegie's philanthropy have acknowledged. She argued consistently for institutional endowments over personal gifts, for giving structures that had longevity built into their design, for the kind of giving that would keep producing effects long after the original check had been spent. Carnegie himself credited her judgment repeatedly and specifically, and the record of what they built together supports the credit he gave her. The Peace Palace at The Hague opened in August of 1913. Carnegie attended the dedication ceremony with what observers described as quiet and genuine satisfaction. He believed he was watching history move in the direction he had been pushing it for more than a decade. He had approximately 12 months before he understood what history was actually doing. There was a third construction project running alongside the steel empire and the philanthropic institutions, less visible to the public and more personally significant to Carnegie than either of the others. A sustained and systematic campaign for permanent world peace that he pursued with the same focused energy and strategic intelligence he brought to every serious undertaking. He was among the first prominent public figures in America to argue formally for what he called a League of Nations, a standing international body through which countries would resolve disputes through law and arbitration rather than through warfare. He campaigned publicly for naval disarmament, which sat in uncomfortable proximity to the fact that Carnegie Steel had manufactured steel armor plate for American and Russian battleships, and that Carnegie maintained an active commercial office in St. Petersburg specifically to supply the Tsar's navy. He never publicly addressed this particular contradiction. He pushed for bilateral and multilateral arbitration treaties between the European powers, attended and funded international peace conferences, contributed to the construction of institutional frameworks for international law, and corresponded with heads of state about the specific mechanics of conflict prevention. He believed he had received a personal assurance from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany that the Kaiser would not lead Germany into a general European war. This belief was not the product of naivete in the abstract sense. It was the product of a specific conversation or series of conversations that Carnegie interpreted with more confidence than the evidence warranted. He wrote in an essay published in 1912 that the safest occupation in any country was that of a soldier, who rarely saw a battle and spent his career in perfect safety, and that it was becoming impossible to imagine educated men dedicating their lives to a profession that civilized nations were in the process of rendering obsolete. He meant this as a description of the present state of affairs, not as a wish about the future. He was wrong about the present state of affairs by an order of magnitude that the following 2 years would make unmistakable. The war began in August of 1914. Carnegie stopped writing. The last entry in his autobiography is dated the day the fighting started. His wife Louise described him in the months that followed as heartbroken, using the word with precision rather than as a rhetorical convenience. The Peace Palace he had funded with such care and pride had been dedicated 12 months before the largest war in the history of the world began. The Kaiser had entered that war 4 months after giving Carnegie whatever assurances Carnegie had understood him to be giving. The arbitration treaties, the League of Peace proposals, the decades of diplomatic effort and institutional investment, all of it had been overtaken by forces that Carnegie had either not perceived or had not been willing to weight appropriately in his assessment of what was possible. Carnegie had been, by the consistent testimony of everyone who knew him, the most alive and energetic presence in any gathering he attended. He danced at parties in his 70s. He led groups in song. He argued about politics and philosophy with a genuine openness to being persuaded that his interlocutors found unusual and refreshing in a man of his wealth and position. His biographer David Nasaw wrote that Carnegie possessed a talent for living that made his retreat into silence after 1914 all the more painful to observe as a biographical fact. By 1916, he was increasingly bedridden. By the spring of 1919, Louise later recalled, his voice could be heard each day asking whether the war had ended yet. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of that year. He died 2 months later on August 11, 1919, at Shadowbrook in Lenox, Massachusetts, of bronchial pneumonia, 83 years old. having given away $350 million, having watched the central project of his final decades prove catastrophically inadequate to the forces it was designed to contain. $30 million remained in his estate at death. It went directly to the Carnegie Corporation, which Carnegie had established precisely for this contingency. Louise Carnegie outlived her husband by 27 years, dying on June 24, 1946, at the age of 89. Still serving on the board of the Carnegie Corporation and still making charitable contributions to the organization she and Carnegie had built together, she remained in the Manhattan mansion on 91st Street through her final years. She was buried beside Carnegie at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in North Tarrytown, New York. Their gravestones were cut from stone quarried at Skibo Castle. Their daughter, Margaret Carnegie Miller, lived until April 11, 1990, dying at 92 years old after decades of service as a trustee and then honorary lifetime trustee of the Carnegie Corporation. She had 4 children. The Carnegie line continues without public prominence. Shadowbrook was sold after Carnegie's death, converted to a Jesuit seminary, and destroyed in an explosion and fire in 1956 that killed 3 priests and a lay brother. The Carnegie Mansion on 91st Street became the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in 1976 and was designated a National Historic Landmark. Skibo Castle is a private members club. The Peace Palace still stands in The Hague and still houses the International Court of Justice. The institutional legacy operates today at a scale that exceeds what the original fortune could have produced without the compounding effect of more than a century of continued work. Carnegie Hall remains among the defining concert venues in the world. Carnegie Mellon University is globally recognized in technology, engineering, and the arts. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace remains active across more than 100 years after its founding. The Carnegie Corporation of New York has supported, over that period, the discovery of insulin, efforts toward the dismantling of nuclear weapons, the creation of the federal Pell Grant program that makes college access possible for students from low-income families, and the early development of Sesame Street. The Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, which began as a $10 million fund to provide pensions for college professors, manages more than $860 billion in assets and serves 5 million people. Carnegie's name appears across cities, universities, cactus taxonomy, scholarship programs, and concert halls on 4 continents. He is buried within a few yards of Samuel Gompers, the founder of the American Federation of Labor and the most important figure in the American labor movement that Carnegie spent his career opposing. The proximity was entirely unplanned. History arranged it without consulting either man, and the result has the dry and precise irony of an arrangement that both men would have found uncomfortable and that neither could have improved on. The Cassie Chadwick affair outlived her death in the Ohio State Penitentiary on October 10, 1907, 2.5 years into her sentence, still refusing to confirm the full extent of her fraud. She has been the subject of a Canadian television film, appeared as the fictionalized character Maud Beaton in the HBO series The Gilded Age, and been studied by historians who have come consistently to describe her scheme as among the most structurally sophisticated financial frauds in American history. What made it sophisticated was not the forgeries themselves. What made it sophisticated was the psychological mechanism that sustained it for 8 years without anyone asking the one question that would have ended it immediately. The most instructive thing about the Cassie Chadwick affair is not that it worked. It is the specific reason it worked for 8 years, and that reason is inseparable from who Andrew Carnegie actually was. Elizabeth Bigley had been running confidence schemes since she was 13 years old in Appin, Ontario, Canada. She had served prison time for forgery. She had operated under multiple assumed identities, including a clairvoyant named Madame Lydia. She had been briefly married and quickly divorced twice before marrying Dr. Leroy Chadwick of Cleveland in 1897 and attempting to enter the social circles of the Rockefellers and the Hannahs through the respectability his name provided. Those circles admitted her to events out of obligation to her husband. They did not otherwise accept her. She needed a different approach entirely. The plan she constructed was built on a single and entirely accurate insight. Carnegie was so famous, His moral reputation so carefully maintained and so publicly prominent, and social embarrassment such a governing force in Gilded Age business culture that no Ohio banker would ask him directly whether he had an illegitimate daughter. The question was too humiliating to put to the most morally prestigious industrialist in America. The silence of people who might otherwise investigate was not a vulnerability in the scheme. It was the scheme's entire operational foundation. She arranged for Dillon, a Cleveland lawyer who was an acquaintance of her husband, to escort her to Carnegie's Fifth Avenue mansion in New York on the pretext of checking employment references for a potential maid. She entered the house, spoke with the housekeeper for approximately 30 minutes, and emerged carrying a substantial brown envelope. As she stepped into the waiting carriage, she appeared to drop a document. Dillon retrieved it. It was a promissory note for $2 million bearing Andrew Carnegie's signature. She had prepared it in advance, and it was a forgery. She swore Dillon to secrecy and confided that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, that he was so consumed by shame at her existence that he had already given her $7 million in additional notes, and that when he died, she stood to inherit $400 million. The well-dressed man she waved to through the window as she got into the carriage was Carnegie's butler, whom she had occupied during her visit on the pretext of inquiring about a maid who had never applied for any position at the Carnegie household. Dillon told everyone. This was exactly what she had predicted he would do, and the prediction was correct because the story was too extraordinary to keep and too brazen to have been invented. The information spread through Cleveland's banking community within weeks. Lenders began offering their services to the woman who would eventually inherit $400 million from the richest man in America. She ran the scheme as a personal Ponzi arrangement, using proceeds from each new loan to service the interest on previous ones, keeping enough separate institutions involved that no individual lender had visibility into the full architecture of her exposure. She borrowed from the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, from Cleveland's Wade Park Banking Company, from Lincoln National Bank in New York, and from at least a dozen other institutions across Ohio and beyond. A Pittsburgh steel magnate who knew Carnegie personally gave her $800,000 without hesitation, on the entirely reasonable assumption that any debt bearing Carnegie's name as collateral would be honored by Carnegie himself when the time came. She spent the borrowed money at a scale appropriate to the story she was telling about herself. She filled 30 closets with clothing. She accumulated diamond necklaces and a $40,000 rope of pearls. She purchased a $9,000 pipe organ, 12 solid gold picture frames, and 8 grand pianos at once, which she distributed as Christmas gifts to people she wished to impress. She was known across Cleveland as the Queen of Ohio, a designation she appears to have found entirely fitting. For 8 years, the scheme held because the structural insight driving it was correct. No one asked Carnegie. Lenders could not discuss their loans with each other because they had each been told the matter was confidential. The men who might have compared notes and recognized the Ponzi structure were individually bound by a promise of secrecy that each of them believed made him specially trusted. Each believed he was among a small number of privileged lenders to a wealthy heir. None understood that dozens of others were in the same position. The collapse came in 1904 when the Boston banker Herbert Newton filed suit demanding repayment on a $190,000 loan. As the case attracted press attention, other lenders began reassessing their exposure. Someone finally put the direct question to Carnegie. His reply, through a spokesman, was both complete and unsurprising to anyone who had thought clearly about the situation. He did not know any Mrs. Chadwick of Cleveland, and he had not signed a promissory note in more than 30 years. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin collapsed in a bank run within days. Chadwick was arrested at her hotel suite in New York, found wearing a money belt containing $100,000 in cash. Carnegie attended the Cleveland trial, sat in the courtroom, and inspected the forged notes bearing his signature. He observed that if anyone had seen those documents and genuinely believed he had produced them, he could hardly have been flattered, and he pointed out the spelling errors with the manner of a man assessing work that had failed to meet his production standards. The court sentenced her on March 10, 1905, to 14 years in prison and a fine of $70,000. Carnegie then donated money to compensate the Oberlin citizens whose savings had been destroyed by the bank's collapse and endowed a library building at Oberlin College. He had been the victim of her fraud. He repaired the collateral damage anyway. It is the most revealing single act of his philanthropic career precisely because it required him to repair something he had not broken, and he did it without being asked. What the Chadwick affair exposes is the specific fragility of a public identity built on selective truth. Her fabrication was effective not because Carnegie was secretly capable of the behavior she attributed to him, but because the actual gap between his stated values and his documented actions made such a secret feel entirely plausible to the people she needed to convince. A man who publicly championed workers while privately authorizing their violent displacement could believably have a shame he was paying to contain. A man who preached democratic equality while purchasing a Civil War substitute could plausibly have a daughter whose existence embarrassed him. The lie was shaped to fit the genuine irregularities in the man it was about, and the fit was close enough to sustain for 8 years against no challenge whatsoever. The tension between what Carnegie said and what Carnegie did runs through every chapter of his story, and it is still running at the very end. He was the man who wrote that no mill was worth a single drop of blood and then cabled from Scotland that he approved of whatever Frick decided. He was the man who funded peace palaces while selling armor plate to the navies those palaces were supposed to make obsolete. He was the man who gave away $350 million and came closer than almost anyone in the history of American industrial wealth to actually proving that dying with money in your hands is a form of disgrace. 3 Carnegies are present in the historical record, and none of them is fully separable from the others. There is the ruthless industrialist who broke unions, bought his way out of military service, and authorized the violence at Homestead while maintaining the pretense of ignorance. There is the genuine philanthropist who built institutions from a real conviction that wealth carried obligation and who gave away 90% of what he had made. And there is the optimist who believed, without performance and without irony, that human beings were capable of organizing themselves out of organized violence, and who watched that belief destroyed by the largest war in history. He came back to Dunfermline, as he had promised himself in some form during those years of watching his father fail. He came back in a magnificent coach with his mother beside him, in her best black silk, the whole town lined up in the streets, having left in steerage and returned as benefactors. He had promised, in the private architecture of his boyhood ambitions, that he would cure the condition of poverty that had defined everything in those years. He cured it for himself. He made gestures of extraordinary scale toward curing it for others. Whether the gestures were proportionate to the damage caused in making the fortune that funded them is a question he did not fully answer in his autobiography, and one that history has not fully resolved in the century since his death. He is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in North Tarrytown, New York, a few yards from Samuel Gompers. The proximity was unintentional. It has the quality of something perfectly arranged. He built more than he broke, gave more than he kept, and lived longer with his contradictions than most men live with their certainties. He came to America in steerage and died having given away a fortune that would be worth billions in current terms, having built institutions that are still operating, still serving people, more than 100 years after his death. He sat in a Cleveland courtroom and inspected forged notes bearing his name, and pointed out the spelling errors with the composure of a man who had never quite learned to be embarrassed by the things that most deserved his embarrassment. That is the record. The institutions are still there. So is the distance between what he said and what he did. What you make of the space between those two things is, as it should be, entirely your own. If this story felt worth your time, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another life that deserves more than a simple verdict.